Professor on record again.
Good. You sure? Okay, well.
Is it on?
It's on.
Okay, operating. Yep, go ahead.
Okay, well. We thank you all for coming out on this brutally cold, record temperature setting evening. I hope, quite sincerely, that none of you showed up last week for the class that we canceled because of some logistical issues. Our registered students did not lament that fact because they spent last weekend up in New Hampshire shadowing two candidates, as far as I can tell, Biden and Buttigieg. If those of you who did not make that trip are curious about their experiences up there, which of course were rich and in depth, perhaps towards the end of our Q&A period you can ask them whether they have any comments on what it was like to be in the North Country far, or at least in Concord, New Hampshire. Secondly, I want to remind everyone that next week our guest speaker will be Governor Bill Weld, who is running as a Republican candidate. I should note that we do not do and are not permitted to do political events on this campus, so we don't. But that doesn't mean that we cannot invite candidates to speak on campus. And I was reading in my Charleston, South Carolina news feed this morning that Mark Sanford, who was also a candidate for the presidency on the Republican side, has decided to discontinue his campaign. So Governor Weld is one of a very small number of Republican candidates. He's been governor. He has run before. He is a former legal colleague of mine, and so we're very much looking forward to his appearance before this forum, and we strongly encourage you to let your friends and neighbors know that it'll be a very interesting conversation. So you can spread the word on that. And I will also note that we are putting together our next two sequences of open classroom subjects. In the spring, we will focus on climate change and resilience with a focus on how cities are dealing with those issues. I think many of you may have seen that only yesterday the Urban Land Institute released its report on living with heat, which looks at a number of adjacent communities, including Lower Roxbury, where this campus is located, to begin to get a sense of what the heat sinks are in our communities. So we'll be dealing with health experts, engineers, sociologists, designers, a range of people who have been dealing with the waterfront and sea level rise, extra heat that we're now experiencing in the summers and cold nights like tonight. And we're also putting together a charrette, which is scheduled to take place sometime at mid-semester to engage local high school students in thinking about and planning for issues of sustainability and resilience. And you're, of course, going to be invited to that charrette, which will take place on a Saturday, sometime late winter, early spring. So the spring semester will focus on resilience, climate change, and sustainability and all of its implications. And we don't yet have a formal title for what we're going to talk about next fall, in the fall of 2020, but it's going to be a little difficult, I think, not to deal with something somehow related to the election. So you can pretty much count on our returning to electoral politics as a fall semester subject. And with that, I think I can turn things over to Professor Ehrman.
Good evening, everyone. So it is my pleasure to introduce two of my colleagues. Claudia Haupt is a professor at the School of Law and at the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. And today, in addition to her expertise on constitutional law, she's going to talk a little bit about some of the First Amendment implications of attempts to regulate some of the big platforms that we'll be talking about, including Facebook, and we'll see some video there. Next to me is Woody Hartzog. So Woody is definitely an expert. He even has a book. You can't have it because he signed it for me, but you can buy it, and it's called Privacy's Blueprint. And Woody is an expert and teaches at the School of Law as well as the Khoury College of Computer Science. And it's great to have them both here. This is a topic, I think, that receives scant attention, but you're going to hear about why it deserves more. And when we hear about it, it often involves breaches or congressional testimony like we're going to see, but I think it's a very rich topic that touches on many of the themes we've covered this semester. So with that, we're going to kick it off with some clips, and then we're going to engage with these two constitutional law scholars about it.
maybe one of you can answer, how could someone who runs a multi-billion-dollar company be so poorly prepared to answer questions that are almost obvious or in some way, shape, or form?
And to tag on to that, what do you think about what you just saw?
I'm going to leave defending Mark Zuckerberg up to Woody.
I won't. I'm not going to defend that. Maybe I'm cynical, and I'll start off with that. The reason why it was very difficult, I think, for Mark Zuckerberg to answer a lot of those questions is because to answer them in a different way than he did would pose an existential question to Facebook. In other words, what it does is it calls into effect the entire business model and operating philosophy of the entire platform. And when you do that, then you start to backtrack on your own reason for existence, right, and business model. And so if Facebook's mission is to bring everyone together in the world and make all information available, and you buy into a certain idea of freedom of speech, then it comes with it imposes an externality or a cost on society. And you can react to that two different ways. One of the ways is you can simply own it, right? Where you say, yeah, we're going to leave all the false information up because we think that on net we're better off having a completely open sort of environment where anyone can say whatever they want. And if we break a few 100 million eggs while doing it, then so be it. But of course, that is not a politically acceptable answer. And so instead, I think what you see is an attempt to sort of massage what is the sort of obvious externalities to a lot of this with a little more palatable sort of middle ground answer.
So now that we don't have to defend him, I think part of the problem is that those are actually hard questions, and the online ecosystem makes those questions even harder than they are, sort of in what I'll call the real world. What this is also real. So the offline world, right? So who's a politician? What's a political ad? What's political speech? Is hard enough to figure out in kind of our pre-online world, and we don't do a particularly good job at that. What role should more or less speech play, right? Like, is it the story about the bots, right? Those are not actually human participants in public discourse, right? So our assumption in previous times has been more speech is better and the truth will win out, right? And it's the marketplace of ideas that somehow leads to truth. Well, if you have non-human participants that can multiply a message and amplify it sort of an unlimited way, maybe speech suppression now is your friend, right? So these are, not to make an apology, but these are actually hard questions.
Oh, agreed. I think they're incredibly difficult questions, and we're still wrestling with one of the fundamental problems that I talk a little bit about in my book. But it's the idea that our entire doctrine around First Amendment and freedom of speech, which characterizes a lot of the sort of American commitment under the First Amendment, was created in an era where speech was costly. And what I mean by that is we could all talk all we wanted to each other verbally, right? Or we could write things down, but it didn't have far reach. But to have something that really had dramatic impact, there were a lot of barriers, right? And there were a lot of costs associated with that. And one of the things, for good or for ill, that social media, not just Facebook, but all social media have done, is dramatically lowered the cost of speech, right? And with that comes, at least initially, we had our first wave, our utopian wave, the social media wave, where I was like, I can post pictures of my food and my kids, and I can, we can be in a global village, and we can all discuss with each other. And then came the trolls, right? And then came the harassment, and then came the election interference. And a lot of that is additionally a consequence of simply lowering the transaction cost of speech.
Let me add a wrinkle to that. So the trolls and the bad guys came a lot sooner in other countries, right? So in the U.S., our First Amendment jurisprudence is built on an experience that is very, very positive towards speech. We're super optimistic about speech. Other countries, and especially European countries, have had a much different experience. And so, the trolls came sooner. They came in the offline world, but they were devastating. And the kind of balance between speech protection in the U.S. Constitution, speech protection and speech regulation, which, side note, is often called censorship here, which I think is a super unhelpful label because we prohibit speech for all kinds of reasons that are not censorship. So speech regulation and freedom of speech in the U.S. has a very different historical pedigree than it does in Europe. And so when we're talking about the internet, we're now talking about an ecosystem that works across borders, which kind of is the whole point, right? It's the internet. Right? And so now you have to deal with these different historical developments that are reflected in constitutional norms of speech protection and speech regulation. And they, of course, clash, and in a big way. And so when you talk to Facebook about European regulators, they're super unhappy because they're dealing with free speech being the First Amendment understanding of free speech. Of course, the First Amendment doesn't apply to Facebook, right? Let's start there. First Amendment doesn't apply when the state isn't involved. This is a private platform. They can regulate any speech they want. But, the First Amendment kind of discourse has just this incredible resonance in U.S. political discourse. And so if you can talk about that, if you can make a First Amendment claim, you shut off my microphone, I say, First Amendment. Right. Of course not. But it just has encouraged sort of an apple pie argument. And you're running up against this very different history and theory and constitutional framework in other countries, and that's just another additional layer of complication on the speech front.
Well, you've made the case for the importance of these issues, so I want to pivot a little bit. We hear about privacy all the time and its importance, but it has been pretty missing from the debates, from the discourse. Could you help us understand it, what it means, and maybe why it hasn't been on the top of the agenda as we head into 2020?
Sure. So I'll start with a story. My book came out, I believe it was in April of 2018, and it came out 1 week before Cambridge Analytica hit the airwaves. And for those that aren't familiar, Cambridge Analytica was the scandal where it was revealed that a number of years ago, Facebook had this application format that would allow people to use third-party services sort of nested within the Facebook community. And one of the things that you could do is, and many of you may be familiar with this, so many of you may have taken like a personality quiz on Facebook, right? So it's like, what kind of person are you? Click, what Harry Potter character are you, right? And you click, you answer the 5 different things, and you're Hermione or someone like that. And it was a fun way to do it, but it turns out that there was this researcher who was working with Cambridge Analytica who deployed this system where it harvested massive amounts of information and turned them over to Cambridge Analytica, who then used it for targeted advertising in ways that we found corrosive to democracy. Right, that they were for false. So they were there for a lot of the things we watched the video for, and it was the largest outcry that we saw with respect to information technology that I had seen in my area since the disclosures by Edward Snowden. And one of the questions that I got over and over was, privacy's been a sort of semi-concern for a long time here, but for some reason, the Cambridge Analytica thing was a bridge too far, right? That's when everyone sort of like threw up their hat and was like, that's it, I'm done with this. And one of the questions that came up over and over was, why is that? Because we've been building this machine, and in fact, the personal data industrial complex has been driving this entire platform debate the entire time. And only just now we sort of get to it. And I think that the reason why is a very limited notion of privacy that both Europe and the United States have been deploying in ways that blind us, I think, to a lot of larger problems that cause us to miss larger problems. And so let me explain what I mean by that. So I teach information privacy law here at Northeastern University, and on the first day of class, I walk in, and for those of you that will be in my class, for those students, this is a spoiler alert, this is what I'm going to do on the first day. I'm going to walk in, and I'm going to say, privacy is ... I'm going to write it on the board. I'm going to say, explain to me what your definition of privacy is. And I, as you can imagine, get a large number of different responses. So for some people, privacy is secrecy. For some people, privacy is intimacy. For some people, privacy is some sort of autonomy interest, or they quote the very famous Warren and Brandeis article, the right to be left alone. But by far, the most common conceptualization of privacy that shows up on the board is the right to control over your personal information. It turns out that the common wisdom initially is privacy can mean anything. Who knows what that terms mean? It's a protean term. But we've actually reached a relative consensus on what industry, lawmakers, privacy advocates, and society in general think about privacy. And the answer to that is control over your personal information, right? Give me control. And if you have control, then your privacy is protected. The problem with thinking about privacy in terms of control is that it leaves out a lot of different externalities that then get imposed. Because the thinking about privacy as control is what got us into the Cambridge Analytica mess. Because what happened is that there was a applet, right? An app that was sort of loaded within Facebook, and it said, "Do you agree to let the Harry Potter quiz," or whatever it was? I don't actually remember what it was, but we'll call it the Harry Potter quiz. The Harry Potter quiz access your personal information and the network of friends that you've connected to. Because the weird thing about privacy in the networked age is that it's not just your privacy, it's your friends' privacy too, because who you're friends with reveals a lot about you. By the way, this also holds true for genetic information. My sister takes the genetic test, and I'm like, please quit taking the 23andMe. She's like, nope, I'm not going to stop 23andMe. I need to know all the genetic stuff. But of course, that reveals stuff about me. But that's an aside. So the app said, could I have permission? And the way that control is manifested in a digital environment is through these permission requests. How many of you, show of hands, have logged on to a website and the cookie banner pops up and it's like, this website uses cookies. Do you agree? Yes or no? I agree. Has anyone done that? Most of you, right? It happens all the time. And how many of you have actually read it? Hopefully none of you, because there's no reason that you ever should have to read any sort of privacy policy or terms of use, because it's irrational to do so. And so the person who downloaded the app clicked, yeah, sure, I agree. I want to know whether I'm Hermione Granger or Ron Weasley. And it turns out that when you signed up for Facebook's terms of use, you also agreed to something. And one of the things that you agreed to is to let your friends sort of share the personal information, right? So in other words, you expose your own information to friends and you trust them. And it all sort of combined together into this massive data extraction initiative where platforms exist to sort of harvest lots of information. And we used to think about privacy, and this is where I'm coming in for a landing. But we used to think about privacy as important because of what personal information did to us. In other words, there was a dignitary right to personal information. So if you were to share something about me, or if you are a major tech platform and you collect information about me in ways that I don't consent to, it's wrong because that personal information is mine, right? And so that there's something embedded in there. But what that conceptualization of data protection and privacy misses is that the personal data industrial complex, and by that I mean Facebook, Amazon, Google, and the whole works, that exists to sort of harvest that information, impose massive costs on society through other reasons, right? So in the desire to collect personal information, they construct these user interfaces to pull out personal information because they're incentivized to do so, right? So in other words, the data spigot has to keep flowing. And as long as the data spigot is flowing, then we're going to design systems to keep it from doing that, and everything's good. But what that results in is lots of externalities that normal data protection laws, like the GDPR. So how many of you here have heard of the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe? Just show of hands, a few people. How many of you got emails around April last year that said, we've changed our terms of service? We thought you might like to know. The reason why is because the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe came into effect. The GDPR has been put forth as the most powerful, robust privacy regulatory regime that exists. But it misses a lot of really important things because it only values data for data. What it doesn't care about is whether platforms are extracting our attention, right? So in other words, they design these systems so that you keep clicking. How many of you have downloaded Candy Crush, right? If you've played an app on your phone where you keep clicking and you keep disclosing. A number of us probably. This is corrosive to our well-being. It has corrupted our democracy by allowing us to be micro-targeted in lots of small different ways, right? So that it knows that I am probably predisposed. If I were to see an ad that's like 7 out of 10 law professors really like, candidate X, I'm like, ooh, well, that's interesting. I didn't realize that law professors like this candidate. Well, I too should like this candidate.
Happens to be another law professor.
Right. And so we can be targeted and wheedled and cajoled in ways to control our information because of that personal information that was extracted from us. And then there's an environmental toll, to say nothing of the environmental cost that it takes to train machine learning, to process personal data, and the e-waste that comes from this. And privacy rules right now say nothing about it, but they should. Because I think that privacy has an important role to play, not only in protecting data as data, but protecting our overall well-being, protecting our democracy and our attention span and our environment and all sorts of other concerns that we might have that are related to the extraction of personal data.
Dan, can I totally hijack this conversation and ask a question? Okay. I'm not here to ask questions, but now I'm asking questions, right? All right, so I think this is super fascinating. I also think that, so number one, this is their business model. So, right, so whenever somebody says, oh, I get to use, Facebook for free. Well, no, of course it's not for free. You pay with your data. Do you really want to give that up? But what I thought was super interesting about your answer is, so I'll be teaching civil liberties next semester, and when I talk about privacy, none of these things come up if I'm teaching this in a U.S. context, right? So, informational self-determination is packed under privacy if I were teaching this class in Europe. It's not here. And, just sort of privacy, the right to privacy in the U.S. has a very specific meaning that's not connected to data at all, right? It's like reproductive privacy, which is, that's good, but that's not data. Hopefully not. And so you brought in the GDPR story. So I think this is to what extent is our theory of privacy not really connected to how we think in U.S. constitutional terms about privacy?
Oh, this is a great question. It's such a good question because the reason why. So I just dunked all over the GDPR. Now let me stick up for it and say that it's a pretty good law for a lot of reasons. One of the important reasons one of the things that the GDPR did is it calls companies to sit up straight and say we should really take this seriously, which actually was maybe one of the first times that it's truly been done on a world stage. And the reason why is because if you violate the GDPR, in theory, you can be fined up to 4% of global turnover, which for a company like Google is a massive amount of information, a massive amount of money, as well as information that required to make that sort of money. And And the only reason that the GDPR works as well as it does, because in modern conversation, so if you're following politics, you'll see that a lot of U.S. politicians will say, we need a U.S. GDPR. You're going to hear this a lot out of California. You're going to hear it a lot from Washington, D.C. They'll say, we need our own version of the GDPR. But the GDPR only works because it is backed up by a commitment to data protection as a fundamental human right, which does not exist in the United States Constitution. Now, in theory, there is a constitutional right to informational privacy, but there have only been 2 cases where that's ever even been recognized, and the person who wanted the privacy lost in both cases. And so it's not really what we would call a robust constitutional right at best. And so without that commitment to that sense of privacy as a fundamental human right, I do think that we see a really large disconnect, which also means it's probably incumbent upon the legislative process and courts, and then ultimately us as part of a representative democracy to demand that sort of change.
So following up on that, yeah, what is some low-hanging fruit? What, you know, if you were asked by another law professor running for president to brief him or her about what fixes you would possibly make. You know, what are some easy fixes? Because part of this is about changing our constitutional culture. That takes a while. But, you know, what in the short term comes to mind?
I can go first if you want to think of the harder things. Because, so Claudia's right. There are really hard problems in here, and I don't mean to dismiss them as though it's easy. I mean, a lot of these political questions we've been fretting over for years. It's just that the scale has now increased dramatically and quickly, so the urgency has also increased. So now we sort of are trying to find the answer. I do think that there are easy things that we could do if we could muster the moral courage for it. One of the things that we could do is get serious about regulation in the private sector. The easiest change that we could possibly make is to embolden the current privacy regulator, which is the Federal Trade Commission within the United States. So the FTC, for those that aren't familiar, is for better or for worse our nation's privacy regulator. It's a little different than in Europe, where there are data protection authorities in every country that their sole job is to enforce privacy and data protection rules. It doesn't exist like that in the United States. We have the FTC. Now, the FTC has the advantage of being able to regulate everything. They, in fact, levied the largest fine that they've ever levied against Facebook for $5 billion, which is a remarkable amount of money, and it actually caused Facebook's stock to go up, right? And so, and of course, because they had priced it in and it was less than they thought it would be, and so there are lots of various reasons why. But one of the things that we could do if we're serious about privacy is simply give the FTC more resources, give them a smaller, a modicum more of power, which there are some easy fixes that we could do. We could get serious about cybersecurity law. So one of the videos we saw is we need a national security law, right? And security is more about than just data breaches. It's sort of holistic approach to data management, and data that doesn't exist can't be hacked. And so we need to get serious about data deletion requirements, right? So there are 1,000 little small steps that we could do. And I should add that a lot of these small steps already exist in bills that have been proposed to Congress. So there are a number of senators, Senator Schatz, Senator Wyden, and a number of others that have proposed some really interesting bills. But honestly...
Can we talk about information fiduciaries?
Yes, I was going to say, so that's another one. So, yeah, I'm going to kick that to you if you want to talk.
Actually, I was going to talk about speech, so you do that.
Oh, okay. So, and then the biggest one. So
I'll jump in.
So if I could make a change, if I were, autocrat for a day or whatever, where I could, just impose the rule, one of the things that I would do, in addition to emboldening antitrust law to get serious about competition and monopolistic power, is to change the relationship between we, the users of computers, and the platforms that we interact with. And let me explain what I mean by that. So right now, the law presumes that all of us more or less have equal bargaining power with Google or Amazon or Facebook, right? This is why we click I agree buttons that are presented to us, because we're negotiating. And after all, no one is making us click I agree, right? We choose to do so ourselves, although the practical I mean, what are you going to do? Not use Google when you're told to apply for a job through the Google services, right? Or fill out a poll where they mandate some sort of Facebook account. Don't even get me started on that. But it presumes that we have this sort of equal amount of power. But in reality, we all intuitively know that that's not the case. We are deeply vulnerable to information platforms because we share our information with them and we operate in the environment that they constructed for us, right? So when we think about privacy as control, so if I could go back to my pet hobby a little earlier, where we say, well, if we have control over information, then our privacy has been respected. But the way that control is manifested is in the form of a drop-down menu. Right? It's not like you get a free-form text box where you can say, "Dear Facebook, I heretofore revoke all rights that you have in my data. You shall not disclose anything and target me in any way. Signed, Woody, click, done. My rights have been enforced." Because we can only operate within the choices that we're given. And Facebook controls that. So we are deeply vulnerable to them. And for the law to treat us as sort of standing on equal footing is kind of crazy. And it turns out there's an entire area of law that exists where where people are in a vulnerable position to others.
Turns out that when you go to we're really good at this. We should do this more often. Turns out when you go to your doctor or your lawyer, they have a ton of information that you don't have, but you really need to make informed decisions about your own life. What they can't do with your information is use it for their own benefit. So we call this fiduciary duties, right? So a fiduciary is you give somebody a decision over something that's important to you, and in return, they have to act in your best interest. And so there are some very smart people who say that maybe we should treat platforms like fiduciaries. So you entrust them with all of your data. They can't use it against you. So say you give Facebook all of this data that suggests that you have a gambling problem. The thing that they shouldn't do is suggest trips to Las Vegas for you. Right. So here's a question, though. Is Facebook more like your doctor, or is Facebook perhaps more like a trustee beneficiary situation? Is it more like a shareholder management, right? So we don't know which kind of fiduciaries are the best model. I think the doctor-patient is plausible. It certainly has the most rhetorical force. But don't let platforms use the data that you give them against you.
Exactly. And that's the easiest fix that I would make. Has anyone here seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off? You know the movie? So you know the scene where they go to the valet and they toss the car keys to the attendant and they go joyriding in it and they go like cruising around and they bring it back. That's a violation. So when you entrust your car to someone, that they're a bailee, right? And they shouldn't go driving around like that. We trust platforms with our personal information, and they should be required to take care of it. And I think that's the fundamental shift that I would encourage as an easy fix.
So one of the low-hanging for kind of easy fixes that I would suggest would be and this is on the speech side, let's stop talking about the marketplace of ideas. So this goes back to, I think Woody has mentioned this before, the sort of idealism at the beginning of the internet. And I think I'm old enough to remember the beginning of the internet.
Those bygone days.
Those bygone days,
information superhighway.
Man, wasn't it a series of tubes, right? That's what it was. So there was an incredible sort of moment where we thought that this was going to be this international thing, that we could all have this utopian, speech is good, kind of exchange of ideas, and everybody could talk to everybody else, and it was all going to be great. And turns out that's not exactly what happened. But in the process, the sort of pro-tech crowd really bought into one of the classic justifications for speech protection in the U.S. sort of constitutional realm, which is the marketplace of ideas. And the sort of, it's been misrepresented over and over, but the basic structure was there was going to be this thing, and more speech was going to be better, and in the end, the best test of truth is for an opinion to sort of prevail in the marketplace of ideas, and it's a very appealing idea that has pretty much zero empirical support. It turns out more speech is not always better. In fact, more speech is probably worse. And when we talk about bots, more speech is certainly worse. There are also two other kind of classic versions of defending the value of freedom of speech. One is autonomy interests. So in order for you to express your autonomy, you have to speak in the way that it best expresses yourself. But on the flip side, there's also a listener autonomy interest. So if you think about commercial speech and advertising, the only way that you can make an informed decision about a product you want to buy is if you get truthful information about that product. Similarly, if you go to your doctor or your lawyer, the only real way you can make a decision is if you get accurate, comprehensive advice. So this is a listener autonomy interest. So you have autonomy interests, and then there's another bucket of free speech justifications, which is democratic self-government. Right? The reason that we want free speech is because we want to be able to govern ourselves. Now, if you look at the examples that we saw earlier, that's the exact opposite. That's the more speech you have, the less able you are to govern yourself. So this emphasis on the marketplace where more speech is always better, to me seems like the wrong bucket to put an emphasis on if you're an online speech kind of person, because you have two other equally accepted, equally kind of valid ideas of why we want free speech, that you should not overemphasize the marketplace. And so I think my advice to some hypothetical law professor running for president would be, don't talk about free speech as a marketplace.
So both of your videos had political implications. And lots of people are saying that there will continue to be people intervening in the electoral process using these tools for the next year or more. How are we as consumers going to recognize what that is and how it's happening? Right? Because we want to protect ourselves, right?
Oh my gosh, this is a great question. So I speak to a lot of audiences about this sort of thing: privacy, platforms, power, and a question that I often get is, what can we do to protect ourselves? Right? Because this is where the rubber meets the road, right? Like what can I do? And I used to give an answer that went something along the lines of this. I said, well, it's important to be critical about what you read online and understand, that just because you read it online doesn't mean that it's true. And you should be very critical about what you disclose, and you should be really suspicious about the sort of emails that you get, because people can be really targeted with spear phishing emails. They will send you your name, and you'll see your name in an email, and you'll go, ooh, that is addressed to me, Woody. I will click on this link, and they spearphish you. They targeted you. Or, and this is really insidious, because people have a tendency to reuse passwords. I have some bad news for all of you. Your passwords are all probably out on the dark web at some point. At least one of them is. And people find that, they sit on that, and then they link that password to you. And you will receive, at some point over the next year or two, possibly an email that looks something like this. Dear Woodrow Hartzog, your password is blank, 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 blank. We have been watching all the dirty things that you've been doing online and all the secrets that you've been sharing, and we will expose them to everybody unless you click this link here and XYZ. It's spam. Don't click it. They actually don't know what you've been doing online. They've just taken an old password that's found in some dusty sort of dark web repository and tried to target you with it. But so you should be I used to say you should be hypercritical of that, right? And you should, and you still should, right? So my advice is still, I think, good advice. But now, when I'm asked that question, you want to know what you can do? Nothing. Well, that's not true, actually. There's one thing that you can do. There's one thing that matters, and it matters more than anything. You can make privacy and platforms and power related to personal information an issue of civics. When someone is running for office, whether it be city council, whether it be state legislature, whether it be someone running for president, ask them, what's your policy on information privacy law? What's your policy on antitrust law? What's your policy on allowing, for example, local law enforcement to use facial recognition technologies? What's your policy on artificial intelligence algorithms that make decisions about people's welfare benefits or make decisions about people's health income, right, or hiring possibilities? Get answers to them, because we, as we just spent a few other minutes talking about, we are vulnerable to these information platforms, and there's not a ton that we can do. Now, that being said, we can still be vigilant. One of the things that the videos recommended is use two-factor authentication. You got to use two-factor authentication. It's a really good sort of easy thing that we can do. But in the aggregate, one of the things that I really resist about the question of what can we do to protect ourselves is that it shifts the attention away from what platforms should be doing to protect us.
So I think, yes, I agree on all of that. I think I have a slightly more positive view because
I'm feeling a little salty tonight.
Yeah, I think you're.
Yeah, aren't you all glad you came out?
Sorry, this is going to end up being a little depressing. So here's kind of the positive spin on that. I resist this is all new and there's nothing we can do and we're in a world that we've never seen before. So it used to be that the printing press was a super disruptive technology, incidentally. So, but there's some lessons that we can learn from that, right? So don't let go of the kind of vetted, long-established media ecosystem just because you have a new media ecosystem. Like, if you read the New York Times in the paper format and you read it online, you're probably still getting the New York Times, right? If you click through your Facebook feed and it's like, oh, something happened and it's really weird and like, wow, look at the news, and I don't even look at enough of that, so I don't know what's out there. But there is still such a thing as a trusted media source. And so I kind of want to push back against the sort of, this ecosystem is all new and we don't know what to do with it, because there still are, even absent, there's ideas about verification, there's licensing, there's all sorts of ideas out there. But I think just don't let go of your common sense, right? Like, you've been in this world long enough. If you see something written on, a sticker somewhere, poster somewhere, and it's like, aliens are coming and like whatnot, right? It's like, well, who said that and why did they say that? And we don't need to completely give up on common sense.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And after that, I took a slow, let me go high here, because I actually am quite optimistic about the way things are headed. Just not in terms of our ability to defend ourselves. But one of the interesting things that's come out of all of this is that it's exposing cracks that have long been there in local journalism, for example. So has anyone here heard of the issue of deep fakes? Do you know what I mean when I talk about deep fakes? So for those of you that hadn't, deepfakes is a colloquial term that applies to a doctored video that uses basically artificial intelligence and machine learning to make people in video appear to be saying and doing things that they never said or did, right? In other words, it is a highly convincing doctored video. And the fear about deepfakes, and this has been something that there's a lot of really interesting information about. The fear about deepfakes is that someone, the day before an election, is going to drop a video of a candidate saying or doing something that they never did, right? And by the time we've remedied the misinformation, it's too late because everyone went already to the polls, right? And there's been a lot of hand-wringing, and there's been a lot of people really upset about deepfakes for good reason. But I wrote an article with another colleague of mine here at Northeastern, Jessica Silby, called The Upside of Deepfakes, where we said this is actually an opportunity. This is an opportunity to reinvest in journalism, right? This is particularly local journalism, trusted sources. This is an opportunity to reinvest in the educational system, right? That provides a populace with a critical faculties that can sort of resist these attempts at interfering with our democracy. And in fact, I'm actually quite optimistic about the future, because even with privacy, I hear a lot of people that are really frustrated. And one of the things I would be really sad if you walked away from tonight with the impression of is that we have no more privacy left to lose, because I couldn't disagree more with that. We have so much privacy that we still should be fighting for and still be fighting to obtain, because we still are on the cusp of a lot of this. Social media only existed since, what, 05, 01, right? It's relatively brand new. So we still have a lot of maneuvering that we can do here. And I'm happy to sort of talk about why I think that the nihilism that often exists with respect to privacy, I think, is misguided. I just think that focusing on sort of atomistic solutions rather than getting the more concrete and systemic change is misguided.
You know, actually, that reminds me of something, and I'm sorry, I'm totally hijacking the question asking again. So, you know, the sort of there's nothing we can do about it nihilism is kind of built into the First Amendment, right? And if you want to talk about being able to distinguish good content from bad content, and you get really worried, and this is the AOC Zuck exchange. You know, you get really worried about being able to distinguish truth from falsity and sort of good content from bad content, and in a way that's built into the jurisprudence around the First Amendment, because we have this really strong idea of content neutrality. So the U.S. Supreme Court has said in interpreting the First Amendment that you can't distinguish based on content and based on viewpoint. And that leaves us in this really weird space where you can't have regulation around hate speech because you don't want anybody to, so you don't have the ability to distinguish hate speech. You don't have the ability to distinguish a lot of things from kind of genuine speech. So in what we call public discourse, lies are perfectly permissible. So there's this case about this guy who lied about the Medal of Honor, right? He was like a candidate for a water board, I think, in California. He was like a, municipal water commissioner. And he said, I totally got the Medal of Honor. And of course he didn't. And so there was a statute called the Stolen Valor Act, and it said, no, you can't do that. You're going to be prosecuted for saying that you got the Medal of Honor. You can't lie about military honors. And the Supreme Court struck it down and said, no, this is a content-based regulation. You can't do that. And so, it's totally fine to lie. There are a lot of contexts where it's not totally fine to lie. So let's go back to the doctor and the lawyer example. You go to your doctor, and they just completely lie to you about whatever diagnosis. You're going to sue them for malpractice, right? And when you sue them for malpractice, guess what the doctor can't do? The doctor can't say, but freedom of speech, I can tell you anything I want. But that's not going to work. So guess what we're doing? We're distinguishing speech based on its content. And that's totally fine in a lot of areas of speech. It just happens to be that we've decided, the Supreme Court has decided that that's not a thing we can do here, whereas other countries have decided, you know what, based on our bad experiences with hate speech in the past, we're going to say there are certain things you just can't say in public discourse, right? And we're going to regulate speech based on that. Now, where you draw the line is for society to decide, but the sort of the nihilist sort of position that we can't distinguish based on content, I think is the wrong approach to that.
So I have one last question, then I want to open it up. One of the business publications I read just came out with their list of 50 firms that one should watch in the next couple of years because they will have such strong growth patterns. And about a quarter of the firms that they listed were Chinese firms that are involved with artificial intelligence, face recognition, and a range of other privacy-related activities. And we here at Northeastern are educating a number of emerging AI professionals and people who will be going into these fields. Presumably, China is way ahead of us in terms of developing those kinds of privacy invasive technologies. What would you say to our students and to potential investors, maybe some of the ethical implications of what it is they're learning to do and what they do with that skill set?
That's such a great question. Thank you for asking it. It's one that I teach at the Corey College of Computer Sciences. I teach a course in information law and ethics. And I have a lot of students who are working on artificial intelligence, machine learning, and things like that. And I try to impress upon them that the power the design is power. Every design decision that you make will affect the world in some way because it channels people's behavior in one way or another. And there are foreseeable uses of that technology. And that you can't divorce yourself from the moral implications of the thing that you're building. Right, and so AI has the capacity, and you hit upon a topic that I'm happy to go into at length on facial recognition, which I think is actually unique among AI. But AI, generally speaking, has the capacity, and I mean this as technologically skeptic as I am, to change the world for the better in a truly meaningful way. But we need a plan as we roll it out, because one of the things that I fear is that in the rush to develop artificial intelligence quickly, we don't take time to consider the moral implications of what it is that we're building and the way in which it's likely to be implemented and the ways in which it's likely to be deployed. Because artificial intelligence, with the great power that it has, can be incredibly biased. We know that if it's is trained on a biased data set, it can have really detrimental and adverse effects, particularly against people of color. We know that it can be inaccurate in some harmful ways. We know that it can be used in oppressive ways, particularly with facial recognition, which is at base a tool of control. It's a way to control people. That I think we have to think really hard, and we have to think about making decisions. But within that same breath, I'm so heartened to be at a university that cares about the human implications of the way in which we build artificial intelligence. Because if there's one thing that I have learned is that people like me can criticize platforms, and Google is like, yes, we take your concerns very seriously, and we take all of everybody's concerns very seriously. And they do, and I don't mean to short actually companies, because I do believe that these companies do tend to take these complaints very seriously. But you want to know who companies listen to the most? They listen to their employees, because it's their talent base, right? And the people that build these machines, and obviously they're stakeholders as well, but the people that build these machines have incredible amounts of power within these companies, right? And so if they show up with a moral compass, then they have the ability to direct how these things are built, and that they can be developed in a sustainable and a safe way. And I've got a whole rant that I'll save on facial recognition, but if anyone wants to get into it in the Q&A period, I think that facial recognition is one of the most oppressive and corrosive tools that I've ever encountered in terms of surveillance technology.
Please ask Woody about facial recognition. So I just want to add one thing on AI. So I've been thinking about AI in medical advice giving in particular, right? So there are a lot of applications that are really helpful, and that are, one of my colleagues calls it automating drudgery, right? So there's a lot of stuff that doctors have to do that AI can just do for them. There's a lot of really useful applications in radiology. AI is very good at pattern recognition, and so it's very useful in radiology and pathology and other types of areas. At the same time, that this is an area that is highly regulated and giving medical. So this is a paper called Artificial Professional Advice that I just recently wrote, and it's about basically this is occurring in a densely regulated space, and it's densely regulated for a reason, because we're dealing with people, right? We're giving advice to people, and so I think in general in the AI space, I would say don't throw out existing regulatory frameworks when you're deploying the AI in a space that's already traditionally regulated. So as a first cut, keep the regulatory framework of professional advice giving in place, of medical advice giving in place, and that involves licensing and malpractice liability and fiduciary duties and medical ethics, right? Keep those things in place and try to adapt the AI to the space that you're using it in, rather than going with what's technologically possible. Go what's socially desirable, and the regulatory and the legal framework around that probably exists for a reason. So this is not a complete. This is kind of like the printing press, right? Like the First Amendment and the printing press, the First Amendment and the internet, probably not all that different. Medical advice giving without AI, we've had X-rays for a really long time, right? We've had technological innovation in this space for a really long time. Let's just see what's possible, but let's keep it embedded in this regulatory framework.
We'll call it the Jurassic Park rule. You got so excited to figure out whether you could, you didn't stop to think about whether you should.
It's on? Oh, good. I work for the government, and there is some public good that's hard to get. I analyze crashes, and people that die can't speak about how they died and stuff. You have to define, you'd like to get the medical information or what the coroner says. It's very difficult to get that. If you have an injury and stuff, it's hard to get that unless you have 10 accidents in the same intersection, which may or may not be true. Happen that way. But so how do you balance that privacy thing with the public good that part of that information could give?
Thank you for that question. I love it. I think that one of the things that we need to embrace in privacy law is a willingness to start balancing that explicitly. Because the way in which privacy law has dealt with a lot of these problems in the past is through what they call procedural regulations. And it largely comes down to a consent regime. Do you agree to let me collect the information? Yes, of course, I agree. And that's an inevitability. It just basically means that all information will be collected. And I think that we need to start thinking about what are models that we could have that allow us to balance this a little better and make substantive judgments about which information is okay and what losses we're expected to tolerate. And the law does this all the time. So I ask my students, is life sacrosanct in the law? And sometimes people say, well, yes. And I say, well, then why do we allow cars to drive on the road? Because we know that a lot of people will die every year because of car crashes. And the answer to that question is, well, we've implicitly or explicitly, one of the two, made a judgment call that the value of travel, right, is worth taking on that sort of risk every potential year. It's a value, the efficiency value that we've had. And having explicit trade-offs it's a difficult conversation to have, but it's one that's important to have, because it's going to sort of trend one way or the other. And then the other way that I'll answer that question in a way that hopefully it doesn't seem like a cop-out is that in the privacy camp, there's an ongoing debate about whether we should collect information at all or not. And there's a sense that if information is collected, then your privacy is violated. And that may be true a little bit, but what Claudia and I have been talking about earlier with fiduciaries is that there may actually be a way to balance privacy and information collection and use through this obligation of the idea of trustworthy relationships, or what some people have called fiduciaries. You share very sensitive information with your doctor, and your doctor does good with it, right? Your doctor helps you and finds public good. And so I think we should get more serious about that model as a way to think about long-term sustainable data relationships where data can be used for good. We can have better, more quality data sets for machine learning, because one of the problems with artificial intelligence is that our data sets are actually not that good. And they're incomplete and they're biased. And one of the ways that we could get that is through more information collection, but then that pushes it back against privacy, right? And one way out of that, at least I think, is trusted relationships, and the other way is to simply have a more frank conversation about the trade-offs we're willing to tolerate.
So I think it's really interesting in looking at the GDPR that that is not necessarily a legal structure which applies universally to users of different platforms. However, we see these platforms implementing changes in their service and how it's been implemented in response to these laws, which really only exist to a certain set of citizens. And so what is really unique to the U.S. is the fact that although we have a lot of policy debate which exists on the federal level, a lot of our legal frameworks are actually existing on the state level. I'm thinking of a recent article of like a Flickr database of people's faces that was used for artificial intelligence or facial recognition. And they encountered a lot of issues because there are people that were from Illinois and they have state biometric protections. So I kind of want to get at this idea of what type of political action can we take on a state level? How politically feasible is that? And what is kind of the best strategy to do so to kind of create these more sweeping solutions, but in places where it might be easier to get that vote in more progressive or privacy-friendly legislatures?
I know that you have feelings about this, so I'm going to step out of the way.
So I do have feelings about this, very strong feelings. So you're right to observe that where the most exciting areas of privacy regulation are right now are not at the national level. And actually, I'll even go one further and I'll say it's not even at the state level. It's at the city level. So a few months ago, earlier this year, the city of San Francisco became the first city in the United States to ban government procurement of facial recognition technology. And then Oakland did it. And then the city of Somerville did it. And now the state of Massachusetts is considering a statewide ban or a statewide moratorium on facial recognition technology. So when I apologize if it came off as too bleak when I said there wasn't much we could do except make privacy a civics issue, because I actually think that's a lot. Because it starts at the city level, and then it goes up to the state, right, this sort of great federalism experiment. And if enough states do it, then all of a sudden the U.S. government starts to take notice. And we are maybe fortunate, not fortunate, to live in a state that is actually incredibly influential on the national stage. So there's a story. Has anyone here, just show of hands, has anyone here ever gone to your mail and you open up the mail and inside there is a letter from a company that you do business with, and the letter starts off, "We here at company XYZ highly value your privacy." And then the first thing you think is, oh no, what did you do? And it turns out that they got hacked for some reason and they notified you of it, right? Well, that is because in 2003, the state of California passed the nation's first data breach notification law. And every other state thought it was a good idea. So California passed it, and then Massachusetts passed one. And they said, well, that was a really great idea. And then the other states started to jump on board. And now all 50 states have data breach notification laws in the mere span of less than 20 years, right? I'm doing math right. Yeah, less than 20 years. So, I am actually highly encouraged by what a scholar named Ira Rubinstein has called privacy localism, which is thinking about privacy at the most local level and then working in outward sort of concentric circles. And we see that that's actually where most of it happens, because the Federal Trade Commission, while it's our nation's privacy regulator, only brings about 15 to 20 privacy complaints a year. It's actually, it doesn't have that many resources. It's a comparatively limited regulatory agency. And so it's incumbent upon state attorneys general, for example, to pick up the torch, and then local city governments as well.
If I trip and fall, no one laugh.
Hi, so I feel like I'm told in a lot of my classes that like the strength of social movements or like trying to change, ideas around certain things within government is successful when you have a really clear message and a concise one more often. But I feel like the difficulty with data privacy is that, for one, as you explained, it's hard to nail down exactly what privacy is in the first place. And then once you start explaining things like cookies and the GDPR, it gets really technical. Like, so if you're someone trying to make that change in the way that people understand that within legislature and want to, like you say, introduce data privacy into civics, what's do you think is the bullet points or the clearest possible way you think to explain that to someone and make it easy to understand? So that way my mom, who doesn't know what a cookie is, let alone doesn't know why I'm telling her not to use Facebook so much, can understand why this is so important.
I think making it personal is usually what movements would tell you to do, right? So we've seen a lot of the more recent big changes especially in constitutional litigation. We've seen the most success when it was just a very simple story about an individual getting harmed in some way. And so I think this is actually a good way to kind of start the conversation. Why is it that you personally do or do not want to disclose certain things about yourself, right? How does that make you feel? Do you feel like you want to control what aspects about you are shared and who they're shared with? And so, I've actually had just recently at an AI-oriented conference, a conversation with someone who said, well, we just have to tax the big media companies more, and they'll be deterred from collecting everybody's data. And I said, well, it's a great idea. France is actually trying that. But that doesn't get to the individualized harm, right? So you're disclosing something about yourself that, if you're imposing more cost for the company on a societal level, they may be deterred from doing sort of in the grand scheme of things, but that doesn't really help you as a person. And this person who'd been thinking about this, as an academic matter for a long time said, oh, I never thought about the individual. And so I think the personal story is actually probably the most compelling if you want to make that case.
I completely agree. And I think that this is really where we have a lot of work to do, because you're right that it seems confusing. Have you ever heard the old saying that any technology of sufficient complexity is indistinguishable from magic? Right? And the cloud computing sort of feels a little bit like that, right? So it's like it's in the cloud, and what's a cookie, and right, and everyone points
there's
up.
No
like,
reason
cloud,
that when
right?
you talk about the cloud, everybody points up. It's a server somewhere.
And so I try to do my best to sort of simplify a lot of things. The cloud is just other people's computers, right? It's like your information stored somewhere else, right? It's usually like a server barn in Kentucky somewhere near a waterfall, and so with respect to privacy, if you want to see change, I think one of the easiest ways to sort of simplify things is just think about privacy as power, right? Like how are we going to limit the power and vulnerability? Because that's something that everybody sort of intuitively understands, right? We are vulnerable to those that have our data, right? We are vulnerable to those that we trust. We are, and thinking about privacy, I actually find privacy to be a grossly unhelpful term, because it doesn't mean anything. And so what I try to encourage my students and my parents, actually, because I talked to my parents about this too. They read my book and they're like, I didn't understand what your book was talking about. And I'm going to write a book. My next book is going to be even, I think, aimed at a broader audience for this exact purpose. And it's going to be thinking about, let's not use the word privacy. Instead of using the word privacy, let's have an experiment and use a different word. If you had to use a different word, what would it be? And in my opinion, the word would be trust, right? I trust you, and that we get, right? Don't betray my trust. I'm trusting you not to do that thing against me. Or another word that I use that's less intuitive and one that really, I think, is ingrained in a lot of modern privacy problems is the concept of obscurity, right? Which is the idea that when information is hard to find or understand, it's safe. Like, has anyone here ever picked their nose in public? I mean, you can raise your hand if you have. You probably have, right? You probably thought nobody was watching you, and you were probably right. Until facial recognition becomes a thing. And then there's an index of nose pickers on Northeastern's campus, right? And so thinking about that is a way to make it real. And that's a way to talk about privacy in more concrete terms, in more personal terms, rather than sort of vague abstractions. Because I feel like that a lot of heft gets lost when we talk about, oh, my right to privacy. Well, what does that mean? Nobody knows what that means. I teach a whole class in that. I don't even know what it means. And so to be more real about it, and privacy law can also be sort of distilled down to basically 3 rules, which I'll talk about later. But in thinking about privacy in more concrete terms, I think is step 1.
I totally support that, but the German Constitutional Court had a important decision on that a couple of years ago. They call it the right to informational self-determination, which in German is one really long word with a lot of syllables.
It's a German super word that has like 75 words built into it.
Informational self-determination.
Right, that's right.
Yeah, so my question relates to free speech. So I have to say, first of all, disclaimer, I completely disagree with the opinion that we shouldn't have an open marketplace and that less speech is more speech. So to turn into a question, my question would be, what is your ideal model to avoid the slippery slope where the window of what hate speech is gets shifted, and then perhaps, in a conservative state, you're not allowed to criticize the church because that's hate speech against religion. Or in a liberal state, you're not allowed to say, hey, I oppose these immigration policies because that's also hate speech. So what would be your solution to that?
So first of all, I think I would really push back against the idea that we don't know the difference between different types of speech, right? We can definitely distinguish based on content, and we do that all the time. So the first kind of thing that we need to decide is whether we want to regulate speech at all, and that's been decided a long time ago. And there are a lot of we take a categorical approach in the U.S., and there are just certain categories of speech that are unprotected, right? Child pornography is one of them, and the idea that we just don't know how to draw lines is just sort of a fallacy we tell ourselves about the American model of free speech that is just inaccurate. So whether we want to call it one thing or the other is really context dependent. The European model of hate speech has grown out of a very bad experience with certain types of speech. There's a long history of just common law type, or it's not common law in that sense, but there's a very long history of judicial opinions on drawing a line around certain types of speech. It is a societal balance that needs to be struck. It's also kind of pushback against an anything goes approach. The marketplace of ideas as an idea assumes that it's an unregulated space. The economic marketplace, just like the speech marketplace, is not an unregulated neutral space. And so the assumptions that go into that are worth excavating. It's not going to be the same approach for every historical and societal context, but it's an illusion to say that we can live in a society where we do not regulate speech at all. And so my first suggestion would be, let's just be honest about what it is we're doing, and let's acknowledge that we do regulate speech, and we have to regulate speech. And and calling it censorship is completely unhelpful. Now, you're throwing in this sort of, well, who gets to decide? And in the platform context, it's very clear that the platform gets to decide whatever they want. In the sort of off-platform, general political context, it will have to be state legislatures, and it's an iterative process of just sort of coming up with the right lines, and there's a long history of regulation, and so let's start there. There's not an ideal model, and I will say that is very context dependent.
Okay, excellent. Do you mean the rules for privacy law? Oh, yeah. So there are 3 rules for privacy law. Actually, before I jump on that, can I just add that thinking about freedom of speech and to tie a lot of this together, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is the way that freedom of speech and freedom of association relates to privacy law and privacy interests generally. And so I think about people that protest. I think about people in Hong Kong that are protesting. I think about people that are protesting on both sides in the Boston Common, and the ways in which that activity can be chilled. What we can think about as like sort of core expressive political activity can be chilled if they're being surveilled at every step, right? If everything you do is watched and cataloged and you know there'll be ramifications for it, then you will be less likely to engage in that activity. So I think that there's actually a relationship between speech and privacy that is important to acknowledge. And then briefly, so for those of you that don't want to audit my class, my information law class, I'll spare you all the details. And for those that wanted to audit the class, please do take it because there's more here. But essentially, privacy law.
Yeah, plus you won't get credit for it.
Right, and you won't get credit for it. So privacy law basically comes down to 3 rules. One of those rules is do not lie. In the United States, it just sounds simple enough, right? In the United States, there's a rule that the FTC enforces against deceptive trade practices, which basically means don't lie. But, of course, the problem is, really quickly, show of hands, if you all needed to hide a potentially damaging fact, like the location of a dead body or something, in a place where you knew nobody would read it, but it was generally accessible, where would you hide it? Oh, Federal Register, that's a really good one. I didn't think about that. I'm making terms of use agreements, right? You could hide. There was a contest where some company said that if you read this, we'll give you like $5,000. And it went unclaimed for like 7 years. And then someone finally read it and was like, what? And they got the money. So do not lie's got a problem. The second rule is do not harm, right? The FTC says you can't engage in unfair trade practices which harms people. But the problem with privacy law is that no one privacy problem arises to the level of what we might think of as a cognizable harm in law. Right? It's death by 1,000 cuts. We reveal a little bit here, and we take a Harry Potter quiz there, and we send a suggestive text to the other place, right? And there are all these sort of small little things that never add up to one particular harm. And then the final privacy rules follow the FIPS, which is the Fair Information Practices, which is basically what the GDPR is built on top of, right? And these are rules that say you have to give notice of data collection, you have to give consent, you have to have transparency. And that's, and then the fourth one, I guess there's like a fourth one, which is that surveillance should be hard but possible, right? You should have justification if you're going to surveil someone. You shouldn't be able to sort of indiscriminately do it. Those are the 4 rules of privacy. Don't quote me on that because that's actually not true, but that's more or less.
You just made that up.
I didn't make it up, but that's sort of like my off the cuff like summary of the entire class that I teach in privacy law.
Yeah, I think there's a book to be written on that subject. In our last couple of minutes, I will just note that a number of us did not join our students this past weekend on their sojourn up to New Hampshire. And I would invite any one of the students who did participate in that trip to say something about what they thought the takeaways might have been. Just so you know, I mean, we're trying to be transparent here about what goes on in class.
Yeah, I think one of the things we were also discussing in class was that instead of focusing a lot on policy, a lot of the people were talking about like the character of the candidates. I remember one man, he was relatively old and he lived right next door to the place we were at the event we were going to, and he told me that although he does not agree with anything that Pete Buttigieg stands for, he has integrity and transparency, so he's his number one choice. So instead of focusing on any policy that he agrees with, he supports Buttigieg solely because he believes that he's has the most integrity.
Yeah, and the underlying question that we began to address in the matriculating student session that precedes this is one of whether in the primaries we are voting on the basis of policies that people articulate or on the basis of their character, and whether being authentic about one's character, which many people would say our president was during the campaign and since, is really the criterion that we ought to use rather than focusing on policy matters. And since a number of our students are political science and journalism students, they play a role in shaping how both character and policy are perceived by the general public. So in the next few weeks of this course, I ask you to think about that because I think that was an important takeaway for our students in visiting New Hampshire and getting out to a couple of rallies and having the opportunity to interview some candidates. So on that note, it's very cold out. Let's thank our speakers for this evening. And we'll see you all next week for Governor Weld, and invite your friends. Thanks.